Okay, hi, and welcome to the next episode of our prologue on programming basic stuff that will later be used for the nature of code. I think we should be able to get through these pretty quick so we can get to the good stuff. But anyways, today we're going to talk about functions. But before we do that, I just wanted to talk about scope. What is scope? It is a refreshing mouthwash that you could... Just kidding. Sorry, another bad joke. Although, anyways, yes, so scope. What is scope? Essentially, it's how things sort of appear or are visible to other parts of code. And actually, I'm going to be changing something that I have been doing this entire time, which I purposely did this way so I could point it out in this episode, but I'm thinking I probably should have just done it the proper way, and so that we could not have you be doing stuff incorrectly. So here we have our blocks of code, right? We have this for loop and it has a block of code, and this new function that has a block of code, and the sprite has a block of code. So with scope, essentially when we declare a variable, it's only really visible to this. So these variables are declared inside this new, right? So once this is over, once this new finishes, these variables will disappear. They won't exist anymore because they only exist within the scope of this new this new function. So let's say we need to use it in other parts of our code. We're going to be making new functions. So what if we need to use it in another function? What do? What we should have been doing this entire time is putting it outside. And now that it's out here, any new functions that we create for this main class will be able to access these variables that we've declared here. So let's just do a quick demonstration of how this works. Okay, so let's do this. So inside here, let's make a variable that is called, we'll just call it new var, because it's the variable we're making inside the new class, right? And that will be equal, that'll be, let's just call it, make it a string, and it is inside, and it's gonna hold a thing called new var, hold a string that says new var. And then let's make an if statement. We'll just put if true, so it'll just go through it. And we're gonna make a var here called if var. We'll make it a string, and it'll just say if var, right? And inside this if, we're going to trace, oops, not an interface, I keep doing that. We're going to trace new var. No, not, so we're going to trace the variable, so new var. So don't put the quotations on it. And we'll just do it at the same time. So new var plus space plus if var. Okay, copy. And then once we're out of this if statement, let's put the same thing. So if we run this, let's see what happens. It failed. So why did it fail? It says unknown identifier if var, and it's highlighting this one that's outside. And why is that? Because inside of this if block we created the if var, but once that if block is done, this doesn't exist anymore. So then once we're out, it's like, what is if var? It's been blasted off into oblivion, so it doesn't exist. So keep in mind that when you declare a variable, it'll be available to all the blocks of code inside of it, but it can't look out. I'm sorry, it can look out, but it can't look in to the more specific ones that are declared in there. I hope I didn't mix that up, because this isn't the first time I recorded this video and I kept switching how it can be viewed. But hopefully that's clear enough. So if we create a variable inside of a more specific one, and once that finishes, it will disappear. That's basically what you need to know about scope. So, let's get to making new variables, right? So, new functions. So, I just talked about scope, but the thing about functions is a little different. So when you make a new function, so let's say we have we'll make it a public function, and we'll talk about public later when we start talking about objects, and we'll just call this our new function. And then afterwards we'll name it, and then we'll put this colon, and for now let's just put void, and we'll come back to that in a second. So here we have a function, and what does this function do? Let's just say it traces I'm a function, just like that. And let's say we run it. What happens? Nothing. And why is that? Because when we start this program, it's going to create this main class. It'll run through its new, this is called the constructor. It's what runs at the very beginning when you make a new class, when you instantiate a class, that is, spawn it. So right now it's just coming in, it's running super, which we'll talk about later once we get into the sprites. Well, we'll talk about sprites, but once we get into objects, and then it runs whatever's after this, and then it doesn't run this because functions have to be called to run. So this is kind of like declaring a variable, but instead of it holding data, it holds instructions, if that makes sense. So if we want to run this function, what do? We call it. And how do we do that? We just type its name, which is new function. We put the parentheses afterwards, and then a semicolon. And then, if you notice, it's a similar setup as this. They put a space in there, which I think is technically proper, but I'm about clean code, but I'm not that specific. So if we run this, it says I'm a function. So it, whoops. So it creates this main, and then it runs the constructor, the new function, and then, oh gosh, that's a confusing name. Let's call it our function. So we run our function, and it will run what we have here. So that's pretty simple. And if we want to run it again, we just put our function like that, and if we run it, it should run it twice. But of course you wouldn't want to do that if you want to run things multiple times. What would you use? Yes, that's right. We'll use the loops that we learned about in the last episode. So anyways, what are these parentheses all about? It's kind of interesting, isn't it? So that's where we're going to talk about arguments. So let's say we wanted to make a function that would add two numbers together. Let's call it public hour add. And we'll just put void for now. We'll come back to that. Whoops. Oh, sorry. I forgot to write function. So, public function our add. I think I had a little bit of C# running, because I think it, well anyways, and it'll do void at the end there. So what is our add going to do? We want it to take two numbers, add them together. So how do we do that? We can just directly type in two numbers, 4 plus 3 equals whatever, but let's say we want our user to put whatever numbers they want, right? So what we'll do is it will take arguments. So let's say we will add two integers together. So we'll do, we'll just call it like number, we'll call it A number and B number. A number, and be sure to say what type it is. These will be integers, right? And a comma, and then our second bit of information we want to put in, we'll put in B number, and that will also be an integer. Okay, and then on the inside we'll just trace for now. We won't. We'll get to something in a bit. So we're going to trace A number plus B number, and keep in mind these are not in quotation marks, so these are actual numbers. They're not the actual letters of a number. So this will add up. So how do we use this function with arguments? So when we type our add inside here with Flash Develop, it'll give us a code hint. We know that we have to put in two arguments for this to work correctly. We have A number, so it wants an integer. Let's put in 3. Okay, we'll put in a comma. It wants B number, so we'll do 7. And it doesn't need anything else, so we'll close it out and then put a semicolon. And when we run it, what will our add do? It traces 10, because we put in 3 and 7. And of course your user would not directly type this in code. We would get the numbers some other way, but basically that's how it'll work. But there's actually probably a better way to handle this kind of thing, right? So what if we wanted to add this number that we added to something else, right? So like if I want to trace the value of this. So this is just performing an action, but we can't really do anything with the information that this kind of new information that it makes, right? So this is when we need to have it return a value. Okay? So how do we return a value? So it's going to add these two integers together, and we want it to return another integer. So that's where this data type after this colon comes into play. So right now it's not returning anything, so we put void. It just does an action and then ends, and that's it. But if we put a data type here, and let's see if we run it now, what does it tell us? So it'll fail because it's missing a return, and it's wanting an integer. And also, let's not worry about that just yet. So it needs to return an integer. So if I, let's do this. So to return, you just have to type return, space, and then what it is you want to return. And we want to return A number plus B number. So copy, we'll just paste that there, and close it out, and we don't need this trace anymore, so we'll comment it out, because maybe I'll change my mind in the future. So when we run our add, it's going to take two numbers, and then it's going to return a number. So when we're returning, technically, when we call this function, we have our add 3 and 7, essentially this now is an integer. So our add function is acting as though it is an integer. So if we come back to this trace, and we'll just cut it and drop it in there. And right now our add is going to equal 10, right? So this is outside of the function. It's, you know, outside of our add function, because it's just adding the numbers and returning the value. But back in new, it is tracing this value. So now that this essentially equals 10, this means 10, we can use it like any other number. Let's add 29 to it. And if we run it, we should get 39. So this is very useful, of course, especially when you're going to start having sort of little utilities that'll add numbers up together, or calculate something and return some value, or maybe it builds a random enemy and then it returns the object that it builds, that kind of thing. So returns are going to be very useful in the future. And also, this will help you understand how some of the built-in functions and things in other libraries will work. So let's say we have a new one here. And if you want to resume code hinting, I think it's, what, Control Shift Space? It'll remind you. And it'll also give a little description of our add. So our add wants two integers, a number and b number, and then what the return type is, it's going to return an integer. So that's pretty handy, like that. So yeah, that's functions and scope. So yeah, keep in mind, when we do these, even though we talked about how it can't see things sort of outside, when you define a function, declare a function, when you do this function keyword, it sort of becomes part of everything inside of this sprite class. So it's essentially kind of the same as a var outside of these other functions, if that makes sense. I hope it does. If not, let me know. And another thing about scope, so this is a class, this is part of the main class, an instance of the main class. So once we start making other variables and other objects, those objects will have a tough time seeing what's inside of this, which is part of this public business. But let's get to that another time. So I will see you in the next episode, and I believe we are going to talk about objects.